Hello there, and tonight I'll be telling you the tale of Sleeping Beauty, a story you likely heard somewhere in childhood of a princess, a spindle, and a long, quiet sleep. It's one of the old fairy tales, set down by Charles Perrault more than 300 years ago, and softened again by the Brothers Grimm a century later. The kind of story that's lived in bedside books for generations, familiar enough to feel like coming home to, gentle enough to follow without effort. We'll keep to the quiet edges of it and let the rest unfold slowly. Oh, and by the way, if you'd like an even better way to listen to our stories, you might want our app. It's called Tonight. You choose the voice that reads to you and what plays softly underneath. A little rain, a crackling fire, the ocean, on their own or all together. You can also set a timer and your phone drifts off when you do. It's a free download. The link's just below this video. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Get comfortable, however that looks for you tonight. When you're ready, close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose and a long, slow breath out. One more, in and out. The kingdom lay in a wide green valley, hemmed by low blue hills. At its centre stood a pale stone castle with 3 round towers and a long banner of cream and gold above the gate. Below the castle, the river moved slowly through reed beds and willows. The road into the village was lined with linden trees. In the late afternoon, their leaves caught the soft light. For many years, the king and queen had wished for a child. They had walked together in the rose garden of the inner court, where the old gardener trained pale yellow and pink roses up the south wall. In the evenings, they sat by the fire in the small parlour. Sometimes they spoke of it, and sometimes not at all. Then, one spring morning, by a quiet pool at the foot of the garden, a small green frog spoke to the queen and told her that a daughter would be born to her before the year was out. And so it was. The child was called Briar Rose. She came into the world on a soft afternoon in early summer, when the windows of the upper chambers were open and the wind moved the curtains gently. The queen lay in the great carved bed with the baby beside her, and the king sat in a chair by the window, and the rose scent came in from the garden below. By the time the child was a month old, the king had ordered a great feast in her name. 12 wise women of the realm were invited. There were 13 in the kingdom, but only 12 gold plates in the royal cupboard, and the 13th was left at home. The plates were laid down the long table in the hall, 12 small suns of polished gold. The wise women came one by one along the linden road, and each was greeted at the gate. The feast was slow and quiet, and lasted most of the afternoon. There was bread on the table, and pale yellow butter in a stone dish, and a soup of new peas and mint, and trout from the river, and small green apples baked with honey. The candles in the iron sconces along the walls were lit even before the sun had finished setting. The cook had laid a clean cloth that morning and forgotten one corner unironed, and the corner sat folded under a plate where no one would see it. A small grey moth had got into the hall and settled on the high beam above the table and stayed there through the meal. When the meal was done, the wise women stood up one by one to give their gifts. The first stepped forward and laid her hands softly over the cradle. "Beauty," she said. The second came after her. "Virtue," and so on down the line. "Wit," "grace," a kind voice, steady hands, a love of small living things, an ear for music, a sense of weather, a long memory, a gentle sleep at night. Each gift was given quietly, in a single word or two, and laid into the child gently. 11 of the women had spoken. The 12th was still preparing to speak when the door of the hall opened, and the 13th came in. She was old, and her travelling cloak was dusty from the road. She walked the length of the hall slowly. No one stopped her. The king rose to greet her, and there was a moment when no one was quite sure what would happen. Then she spoke, and her voice was tired more than anything else. She said that on the girl's 15th birthday, the girl would prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and would fall then into a long sleep. She said no more. She left without wine. She turned and walked back down the hall and out through the door, and the linden road took her wherever she was going. The 12th wise woman had not yet given her gift. She came forward slowly, and she stood by the cradle for a long time. She could not undo what the other had spoken. The gifts of wise women cannot be unpicked, only softened. So she gave what she could. She said that the sleep would not be the long dark that the 13th had meant. It would be only 100 years of quiet. And when those 100 years were ended, the girl would wake, and the kingdom with her, and the world would still be there, and the spring would still come. She laid her hand on the child's forehead and went back to her place at the table. The candles in the hall guttered once and steadied. The feast ended quietly. The wise women slept that night in the long west wing, and in the morning they took the linden road home. In the days that followed, the king gave a soft order. Every spinning wheel in the kingdom was to be taken down from its place and put away. They were carried out of the cottages in the village and out of the long workrooms in the castle. Some were small, and some were tall, and some had been used by the same family for 3 generations. They were stacked in a dry barn beyond the river, and the door was closed, and a wooden bar was laid across it. The women of the kingdom learned other work for a time. There was no great fuss. One thing was simply folded away slowly, the way one folds a blanket at winter's end. Briar Rose grew up in the castle without ever seeing a spinning wheel. She walked in the rose garden with the old gardener and learned the names of the roses. She rode a quiet grey pony down to the river. She sat with the cook in the kitchen on rainy afternoons and helped to roll out the long, pale ribbons of pasta dough on the floured board. She slept well at night, as she had been promised, and woke easily in the morning. The years went by softly. Spring came and went, and the lindens flowered and dropped their flowers. Summer followed, and the hayfields were cut and stacked in long, pale rows. Then autumn, and the apples were brought in. In winter, the river froze along its edges. The child became a girl, and the girl became almost a woman. On the morning of her 15th birthday, the king and queen were away at a small estate in the south of the kingdom. They had gone to see about a new orchard. They had told Briar Rose that they would be back by the evening, and they had kissed her at the door. And the carriage had gone down the linden road in the soft, early light. Briar Rose woke late that morning. The servants brought her bread and honey and warm milk in a stone cup. She ate by the open window of her chamber. The day was hers to spend as she liked, and she had decided to spend it wandering through the castle. She had grown up in the castle, but the castle was very large. There were wings she had not been in. There were stairs she had not climbed. She walked the long gallery first, where the old portraits hung in their dark frames. Then she walked through the small library, and through the music room, and through the long room where the linen was kept folded in cedar chests. The lavender bags between the sheets gave off their soft, dry smell. She walked through the cool stone kitchens, where the cook was making a slow stew for supper. And the cook gave her a piece of cheese, and she ate it as she went. By the middle of the afternoon, she had come to the foot of a narrow staircase she had never noticed before. It wound up inside the south tower. The stones of the steps were worn in the middle, as if many feet had once gone up and down. She began to climb. The staircase turned in a slow spiral. There were small slit windows along the way, and through them she could see the kingdom, the river, the linden road, the pale hayfields, the blue hills in the far distance. The light fell across the stones in slanting bars. At the top of the staircase was a small wooden door. The door was unlocked. Inside the small round room at the top of the tower, an old woman was sitting on a low stool by the window, working at a spinning wheel. Briar Rose had never seen a spinning wheel before. She stood in the doorway and watched. The wheel turned slowly under the old woman's hand, and the thread came out of the bunched wool and ran along the spindle, and the spindle wound it up evenly. It was the most quietly satisfying thing Briar Rose had ever seen. "What is that?" she asked. "It is a spinning wheel," said the old woman. "It makes thread out of wool. May I try?" The old woman did not answer. She moved aside on the stool, and Briar Rose came in and sat down. She put her hand to the wool, and the wheel began to turn under her hand, and the thread began to come out of it. And then, in the soft and curious way of small accidents, the spindle touched her finger. It was not very much. It was a small, bright point against the skin. She set down the wool. She looked at her finger for a moment, and then the long sleep took her. It took her quietly. She slid down from the stool, and the old woman caught her under the arms and laid her on the small bed in the corner of the round room. The old woman drew a pale linen sheet up over her. Then the old woman went out of the room and down the stairs and out of the castle, and no one ever saw her again. The sleep moved out of the round room very slowly. It went down the spiral staircase first. The dust on the worn steps settled and stayed. The light at the slit windows did not change, but it stopped moving. It came down into the long gallery. The old portraits in their dark frames did not change either. The candles in the iron sconces, which had been lit early for the short autumn afternoon, burned more slowly. They did not go out. They simply stopped burning down. It came into the small library, where a young scribe was halfway through copying a long letter at a table by the window. His pen was in his hand. He set it down without meaning to. He laid his head on his folded arm. The ink in the small horn dried very slightly at the edge and then stopped drying. The letter lay on the table for 100 years. It came into the music room where a girl was sitting at the harp. She'd been about to begin a piece. Her hands were on the strings. They stayed there, and the strings stayed where they were, and the room was quiet. It came into the long room where the linen was kept. The chambermaid had been folding a sheet onto the top of a chest. The sheet stayed half folded. The lavender bag at the bottom of the chest kept its lavender smell. It came into the cool stone kitchens. The cook had been stirring her slow stew. The spoon stayed in her hand, and the stew stayed in the pot. The fire under the pot stayed low and orange and steady. The cat at her feet, which had been about to step into the next room, set its foot down softly and slept where it stood. Then it lay down. The mouse in the corner, which had been about to run, slept too. It came out into the inner court. The old gardener had been pruning the south wall of yellow roses. His hand was on the small, curved knife. He set the knife down on the stone bench beside him. He sat down on the bench and put his back against the warm stone and slept where he sat. The yellow roses stayed where they were, half pruned, and the cuttings on the path stayed where they had fallen. It went down through the gatehouse and into the village beyond. The baker was lifting a tray of small, round loaves from the oven. He set the tray down on the long oak board. The loaves stopped cooling. The smell of bread filled the bakery. The blacksmith's hammer was raised above the anvil. He laid it down on the anvil and sat down by the bellows and slept. The boy who turned the bellows slept on the wooden handle. The fire in the forge stayed orange and low and even. The sleep came to the river last. The miller in the mill by the river had been pouring grain into the hopper. He set the sack down and slept against the warm wooden wall. The wheel of the mill stayed where it was, half turned. The water at the wheel held still in a long, soft curve. The fish in the deep pool below the wheel slept too, and the reeds along the bank stilled, and the lindens on the road stopped putting out their leaves for that year and held what they had. The kingdom was very quiet. In the spring of the following year, a small green shoot pushed up at the foot of the outer wall of the castle. It was a briar with thin red stems and small new leaves. By the end of the summer, it had climbed the height of a man. By the end of the next summer, it had reached the top of the wall, and a second shoot had come up beside it, and a third beside that. The briars grew slowly and steadily. They grew without hurry and without stopping. The thin red stems thickened. The leaves came out in soft green clusters. Small white roses opened along the canes in early summer and dropped their petals on the path below in late summer. In the third year, the briars met above the gate of the castle and made a low arch. In the fifth year, they had climbed up to the windows of the lower floor and laid their stems across the sills. In the 10th year, they had reached the eaves. In the 20th year, they had begun to cover the terrace. The briars grew over the orchard wall and into the orchard, and they grew along the linden road, and they wound around the stones of the bridge over the river. They stopped short of the village. They stopped at the edge of the gardens where the cottages began. By the end of the 1st century, the castle could not be seen at all from the linden road. There was only a great, soft green mound where the castle had been, with white roses opening along it every summer, and the towers showing in pale stone shapes here and there beneath the green. People in the next kingdom heard about the green mound. They came sometimes to look at it from the linden road. They kept their distance. The briars were too thick. They stood at the edge of the road and looked. And after a little while, they turned and went home. In the 100th year, a prince of a nearby kingdom was riding through the linden country. He was a young man with dark hair and a quiet way of speaking. He rode without errand. He had simply set out one morning to see what was on the other side of the hills. He came one evening to a small inn at the edge of the linden country. The innkeeper gave him bread and pale yellow cheese and a cup of dark beer. They sat by the fire after supper, and the prince asked about the green mound that he had seen from the road. The innkeeper told him the story slowly. He told him of the castle, and the king and queen, and the child, and the 12 wise women, and the 13th. He told him of the spinning wheel, and the long sleep, and the briars. He had heard it from his grandfather, who had heard it from his grandfather. He did not tell it as a warning. He told it simply because it was there, and the prince had asked. The prince listened. He drank his beer slowly. He did not say very much. In the morning, when he rode on, he took the road toward the green mound, rather than the road back over the hills. He came to the briars in the soft light of a summer afternoon. They were taller than he was, and thicker than the trunk of a man, and the small white roses were opening along the canes. The way was closed. He got down from his horse. He tied his horse to a linden tree at the side of the road, where there was good grass and shade. He laid his hand against the briars. The briars parted under his hand. They parted slowly. They parted as a curtain parts when pulled back. A narrow, soft green way opened ahead of him. As he walked into it, the briars closed slowly behind him, and the new length of way opened ahead. The roses brushed his shoulders and his sleeves as he passed. He went on for a long time. The green light under the briars was soft and even. He could smell the roses and the warm summer wood of the canes, and the faint, cool smell of the old stone walls somewhere beyond. The birds were silent. He could hear his own steps on the soft ground. He walked steadily, without hurry, and the way opened steadily ahead. The way through the briars brought him at last to the gate of the castle. The gate was open. The gatekeeper was asleep on the stone bench inside, his hand still on the long iron key. The prince walked past him quietly. He came into the inner court. The old gardener was asleep on his bench against the warm south wall, with the small curved knife on the stone beside him. The yellow roses on the south wall were still half pruned. The cuttings were still on the path, dry now, but unmoved. He went in through the great door. He walked the long gallery, where the old portraits looked down from their dark frames. The candles in the iron sconces were still lit. They burned as before. He went past the small library, where the scribe slept at his table, with the pen laid down beside the half-finished letter. Beyond it lay the music room, where the girl slept at the harp, her hands still on the strings. Further on, the chambermaid slept in the long room with the half-folded sheet on the chest. He went down into the cool stone kitchens. The cook was asleep on her stool by the pot. The spoon was in her hand. The fire under the pot was still low and orange. The cat on the floor was still curled against her foot. The mouse in the corner was still asleep in its small, soft shape. The long west wing, where the wise women had once slept after the feast. The doors of the rooms stood open. The rooms were empty. He came back down again. He came at last to the foot of the narrow staircase that wound up inside the south tower. He climbed it slowly. The stones of the steps were worn in the middle, as if many feet had once gone up and down. The slit windows let in slanting bars of soft afternoon light. He came to the small wooden door at the top. He opened the door. Inside the small round room, on the small bed in the corner, Briar Rose was asleep. The pale linen sheet was still drawn up over her. Her hair was on the pillow the way it had fallen 100 years before. The spinning wheel was still in its place by the window. The wool was still on the spindle. The prince stood in the doorway for a long time. He felt no need to hurry. The afternoon light came through the small window and lay across the stone floor. A single white rose petal had drifted in through the open window at some point in the last 100 years and lay on the floor near the bed. After a while, he went over to the bed. He knelt down beside it. He looked at her face. He thought she was very beautiful. He leaned down. He kissed her once on the forehead. She opened her eyes. She looked at him for a moment, calm. Then she smiled, a small, slow smile. She sat up on the edge of the bed. She put her hand to her hair. "You have been a long time coming," she said. "I have come now," he said. They went down the stairs together. In the cool kitchens, the cook stirred her pot once more. The cat at her feet stretched its back and walked into the next room. The mouse in the corner ran. In the long room, the chambermaid finished folding her sheet and laid it on top of the chest. In the music room, the girl began the piece she had been about to begin, and the harp sounded sweetly through the gallery. In the small library, the scribe picked up his pen and dipped it in the horn and finished the long letter. In the inner court, the old gardener took up his small curved knife and went back to the yellow roses on the south wall. In the village, the baker took up the tray of small round loaves and carried them through to the front of the shop. The blacksmith picked up his hammer and brought it down softly on the anvil, and the iron rang out once. The boy at the bellows opened his eyes and pumped the handle. The miller poured the rest of the grain into the hopper, and the wheel of the mill began to turn again, and the water moved along it in a long, soft curve. The fish in the deep pool below the wheel woke and turned in their slow circles, and the reeds along the bank moved in the small wind, and the lindens along the road began, very slowly, to put out their new leaves. The king and queen, who had been at their small estate in the south of the kingdom 100 years before, woke in the small parlour, where they had sat down to wait for the news of the south orchard. At first they were confused. They went out into the courtyard and looked at the sky. The sky was the same sky. After a little while, a servant came to tell them, very quietly, what had happened and what had now ended. They came back to the castle by the Linden road in a slow carriage on a soft summer evening. There was a wedding in the rose garden of the inner court on a soft evening at the end of summer. The king and queen were there. The cook was there in her best apron, with the small cheese knife still tucked in her belt. The gardener was there. The chambermaid was there with the folded sheet finished and put away. The scribe was there with the finished letter sent. The 12 wise women came too, down the Linden road in the late light. They were 100 years older, but they were not very different. They sat at the long table where the christening feast had been held, and they ate slowly, and they did not say very much. The 13th did not come. Nobody had heard from her in 100 years, and nobody quite thought of her that evening, except in the soft way one thinks of someone who is far away and well. The candles in the iron sconces along the walls were lit. The bread and the butter were on the table, and the soup of new peas and mint, and trout from the river, and small green apples baked with honey. The roses on the south wall were open in the late light, yellow and pale pink and white, and the briars at the outer wall had pulled back, and the gate was open, and the Linden road came in quietly between the trees. When the meal was done, Briar Rose and the prince walked together along the path under the south wall. The old gardener had finished his pruning. The cuttings had been swept up and burned. The sky above the towers was a soft, deep blue, and the first stars were out. In the small round room at the top of the south tower, the spinning wheel had been moved gently to one side, and a small linen cloth had been laid over it. The bed had been made fresh. The window stood open onto the warm summer air. Briar Rose fell asleep that night in her own bed, in the chamber where she had been born. The pale curtains moved softly at the open window. Somewhere in the village, a dog turned in its sleep. Somewhere in the lindens, an owl spoke once and was quiet. And the castle was quiet. And the garden was quiet. And the lindens along the road were quiet. Just the night. Just the slow, warm air. Just the soft white roses along the wall. The white roses stayed open through the dark,